Disembodied Pain and the Limits of Armchair Philosophy. Thought Experiments, Part 3. Go on, pinch yourself. Not too hard, but hard enough to make it hurt a little. Philosopher Brie Gertler proposed a new thought experiment that asks us to do just that, and then ask, could that pain you feel exist without a body? I suspect you have strong intuitions as to whether such a scenario is possible or not. This article is part 3 of our series in the thought experiments in the philosophy of mind. Thought experiments like Gertler's Disembodied Mind and David Chalmers' P-Zombies, discussed in part 2, rely on the conceivability argument. Such arguments assume that if we can conceive of something, it is possible. They start with a claim that something is conceivable, for example, P-Zombies are conceivable, or disembodied pain is conceivable, and then move to the second claim, that what is conceivable is possible. We've discussed the controversy and potential problems with this approach in parts 1 and 2, so we won't rehash those issues here. Instead, we'll use Gertler's disembodied pain argument to examine the proper use and potential consequences of misusing such arguments. The disembodied pain argument is ideal for this task because in the paper that outlines the thought experiment, Gertler provides a test for evaluating when conceivability arguments are appropriate in philosophical discussion. For our series on thought experiments, this article is a bookend to our discussion on conceivability arguments, but it also marks a shift in our exploration of perception. Recently, we've been discussing the potential importance of having a body for perception. Last week, we discussed visual perception. Gertler's thought experiment has us consider a different type of perception, pain, and whether it might be conceivable to experience pain without a body. Conceivability arguments are, of course, not the only type of argument found in thought experiments in the philosophy of mind. So the next article in the thought experiment series will explore a different type of argument, the knowledge argument. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. This week, we're asking when, if ever, can we legitimately use the conceivability argument? To find out, let's ask 3 questions. 1. What is the disembodied pain thought experiment? 2. What standard does Gertler set for the use of conceivability arguments? And 3. Do any conceivability arguments meet this standard? Notes. If you want to read more about conceivability arguments, I recommend Gertler's paper. It is refreshingly clear. It doesn't read like a typical philosophical paper. And if you're interested in a fantastic discussion on the controversies surrounding conceivability arguments, I recommend checking out the comment section in part 1, Is Everything We Imagine Possible? And part 2, the P-Zombie argument. There's a goldmine of insightful comments to be found there. Question 1. What is the disembodied pain thought experiment? The disembodied pain thought experiment begins by self-inflicting a little pain. Unlike many philosophical thought experiments that start with pure thinking, this one asks us to create a real situation. So gently pinch yourself, perhaps the inside of your leg or the underside of your arm. The pain shouldn't be severe, but just noticeable enough to focus your attention. Once you're feeling this sensation, the mental exercise can begin. Imagine experiencing this exact same pain, its intensity and quality, but without having a body at all. In this imagined scenario, you feel the pain, but you don't have a leg or an arm. You don't have any physical form whatsoever. The challenge is to conceive of this pain existing in a completely disembodied state. You are simply a consciousness experiencing pain without any associated physical structure. Once this imagining is done, the argument unfolds in a similar way to most conceivability arguments. Here's the structure outlined in Gertler's paper. Premise 1. Even though I know I have a body, I can conceive of experiencing this pain while having no body. In other words, I can conceive of experiencing this very pain while disembodied. Premise 2. If I can conceive of a particular scenario occurring, then that scenario is possible. So, it is possible that this very pain occurs in a disembodied being. Premise 3. If this very pain was identical to some physical state, then it could not possibly occur in a disembodied being. So, this very pain is not identical to any physical state. So, the conclusion, the identity thesis, which says that every mental state is identical to some physical state, is false. Here, Gertler focuses on attacking the identity theory, but a similar argument could be leveled against other physicalist theories too. If you're familiar with conceivability arguments, you'll recognize the structure of Gertler's argument. Regular readers of this newsletter will note its similarity to Chalmers' P-zombie argument. Unsurprisingly, many criticisms leveled against the P-zombie argument have also been raised against the disembodied pain argument. Gertler anticipates these criticisms and addresses them in her article. We won't review all of her arguments here. Instead, we'll focus on her response to one of the main criticisms leveled at the conceivability argument, that conceivability is too broad a criterion for possibility. People can imagine all sorts of fantastical scenarios that we wouldn't consider possible. For example, we might imagine a universe where time flows backwards, gravity repels instead of attracts, and conscious clouds of cotton candy engage in philosophical debates while floating through rainbow-coloured oceans of liquid music. But that doesn't mean it's possible. Gertler addresses this concern by proposing a stringent standard for when conceivability can be taken as evidence of possibility. Question 2. What standard does Gertler set? The allure of thought experiments lies in the idea that they can be conducted from the comfort of your favorite armchair. They don't require going out into the world to collect empirical evidence. Instead, they rely on our ability to imagine and reason about scenarios purely in our minds. But this very characteristic is also a common point of criticism for such arguments. The main critique of the conceivability argument is that it requires what some might consider intellectual overconfidence. All reasoning, whether in philosophical discussion or everyday conversation, relies on concepts. Concepts define what we are discussing. We simply cannot communicate meaningfully without some shared understanding of what we are talking about. For instance, consider water. In ancient Greece, before modern chemistry, people considered water to be one of the 4 fundamental elements alongside fire, earth, and air. Based on their understanding and observations, the Greeks discussed water by relying on this shared understanding of water. But our concepts can change. Nowadays, water is understood to be a compound of hydrogen and oxygen, H2O, not a fundamental element. Because our concept of water has changed, our discussions about water have also changed. Since all of our discussions involve concepts, some philosophers argue that we should be skeptical of conceivability arguments in general. These critics point out that there's always a possibility that our concepts don't perfectly align with reality. So while we may be able to conceive of something and that conception might reflect a real possibility, it's equally possible that our concepts are flawed because we have an incomplete or mistaken understanding. Gertler, however, cautions against completely rejecting the conceivability argument. She argues that the argument has merit so long as we only use it under certain conditions. Specifically, Gertler suggests that arguments based on the conceivability argument, like the disembodied pain thought experiment, will only succeed if the concepts involved in that thought experiment are sufficiently comprehensive. Gertler is not the first to make this claim. Indeed, Descartes, who relied on the conceivability argument for his substance dualism claim, acknowledged that for his argument to work, the concepts must be complete and adequate. So, What does it mean for a concept to be sufficiently comprehensive? Gertler recognizes that sufficiently comprehensive is a very high bar. Most of our concepts do not meet this high standard. Water, she suggests, is a great example of a concept that fails to meet this standard. We might say that we can imagine water without H2O, but of course, water without H2O is impossible. Water is composed of hydrogen and oxygen, so it could not be without it. So even the concept of water, a concept we think we know really well, is not sufficiently comprehensive to be used in the conceivability argument. The reason that water fails to meet the high standard of being sufficiently comprehensive, Gertler argues, is that water has a hidden essence that can be discovered only by careful scientific investigation. Our concept of water as H2O cannot be known from the convenience of our comfy armchair. Question 3. Does the disembodied pain argument meet this standard? So, what about pain? Can we conceptualize pain from that cozy armchair? Gertler argues that pain, unlike water, has no hidden essence. If we feel pain, then we know pain. Our concepts of pain don't require careful scientific investigation. Gertler claims that this observation that the feeling of pain is pain means that our conception of pain is sufficiently comprehensive for use in the conceivability arguments. But let's discuss that little word is. The tiny, seemingly unimportant word found between the word pain and the phrase the feeling of pain. We discussed the word is in the article on the identity theory. It's worth recapping here what we covered there. The philosopher U.T. Place explains that we use the word is in 3 different ways. The is of definition. To use is in the definitional sense, the statement will be necessarily true by definition. The statement, a square is a shape with 4 equal sides, is true based on the very definitions of the terms square and 4 equal sides. Just like a mathematical equation, everything on the left side of the word is must be identical to everything on the right side. Notice how the is of definition is argued on logical grounds. We can make these arguments from that comfy armchair. Arguments made on logical grounds are often arguments about the meanings of words. This can be expressed as X is by definition Y. The is of composition. Using the is of composition means stating something about a thing's composition or the nature of that thing. The statement, water is H2O, is a statement about the nature of water. The statement is true, but it's not true by definition. We can't use logical grounds to prove this statement right or wrong. In most cases, we need empirical evidence to support or refute such claims. This can be expressed as X is composed of Y. The is of predication. To use the is of predication is to describe a feature or attribute of a thing. For example, Superman is 6 feet tall. Here, we're not saying that Superman is by definition 6 feet tall. The concept of Superman is not identical to the concept of 6 feet tall. But we're also not saying that Superman is composed of 6 feet tall. The phrase 6 feet tall simply describes the height attribute of the noun Superman. We'd need empirical evidence to support or refute these types of claims too. This can be expressed as X has the attribute of Y. When Gertler argues that pain is the feeling of pain, she's using the is of definition. She's claiming something about the definition of pain. Pain is defined by how it feels. Pain is, by definition, the feeling of pain. For the disembodied pain argument to meet Gertler's high standard of being sufficiently comprehensive, the concept of pain must use this type of is. Any other conceptualization of pain that uses a different type of is would imply that pain potentially has a hidden essence. And if pain has a hidden essence, it can't be discovered by armchair thinking alone. We know Gertler conceptualizes pain using the is of definition when she claims pain is the feeling of pain. But here's the question. Does the disembodied pain thought experiment use the same is, or does it use some other type of is? Let's review premise 1. Even though I know I have a body, I can conceive of experiencing this pain while having no body. In other words, I can conceive of experiencing this very pain while disembodied. This claim doesn't seem to be questioning the definition of pain. If it were, we might expect the premise to be I can or I can't conceive of pain without the feeling of pain. In other words, we'd expect premise 1 to be a premise that questions the statement pain is the feeling of pain. But this is not what we find in premise 1. The underlying is statement being questioned in premise 1 might be something more like pain is physical or pain is not physical. These statements use the is of composition, not the is of definition. In fact, the entire disembodied pain argument is designed to question the nature of pain. Anytime we question the nature of things, we are susceptible to the problem of concepts outlined by Gertler herself. Our concepts may not perfectly align with reality. So, does Gertler's own thought experiment inadvertently fail to meet her own high standards? If it does, what does this say about other thought experiments that rely on conceivability arguments? So, is there ever an appropriate use of the conceivability argument? In their simplest logical form, conceivability arguments are structured like this. Premise 1, I can conceive of X. Premise 2, if I can conceive of X, then it is possible that X. Conclusion, it is possible that X. Conceivability arguments seem appropriate for definitional uses. For example, if we consider a square is a shape with 4 equal sides, we can easily conclude from our armchairs that a square without 4 equal sides is inconceivable and thus impossible. But this use, while logically sound, feels trivial. In the philosophy of mind, conceivability arguments frequently appear in thought experiments about dualism. Typical premises are either I can or I can't conceive of a conscious experience without a physical body, for example, the disembodied pain argument, or I can or I can't conceive of a physical body without conscious experience, for example, the pea zombie argument. These statements are about the nature of consciousness, so we might question whether we can legitimately accept or reject premise 1 based solely on armchair thinking. When we make such armchair-based claims about conceivability, especially when those claims are claims about the nature of things, we risk smuggling in concepts that are not sufficiently comprehensive. In other words, to assess premise 1, we might unknowingly smuggle in assumptions based on our incomplete understanding and our biased intuitions. This would be a problem. Our reasoning would become circular if we are inadvertently inserting our conclusions into premise 1. We might find ourselves begging the question. Whether or not all conceivability arguments in the philosophy of mind beg the question is the subject of much debate. But given the concerns, many find the thought experiments that do rely on conceivability arguments unpersuasive. It's worth noting that this criticism can be applied to both physicalist and non-physicalist positions. This skepticism raises an important point about the relationship between conceivability and different types of possibility. In part 1, we discussed logical, metaphysical, and physical possibilities. Conceivability arguments seem most reliable when dealing with logical possibility, which is closely tied to definitions and conceptual truths. But when we apply conceivability to other forms of possibility, they become far more contentious. If conceivability arguments are only persuasive when dealing with statements of logic, what can we confidently say about the category of metaphysical possibility? You might be wondering what all of this means for our understanding of pain. Given the challenges of using conceivability arguments, we might be skeptical of relying solely on conceivability to understand pain. If so, it's worth exploring what we could learn when we get up from our philosophical armchairs. So, next week, let's explore what neuroscience has to say about pain. Thank you so much for listening to this article. I just want to take a small moment to say thank you. Every week, I am floored by the comments and the interaction we have here on Substack. The comments are always really insightful and challenging and make me think, and it's really fun to be a part of. So I'm really glad you're here, and I'm glad I am too. So I just want to say thank you so much for your support. It's pretty amazing. If you want to support my work in other ways, you can like and subscribe, and you can contact me, comment, email me, like the article, do all of those things that people do. And if you would like to support my work in more tangible ways, you can do that in two ways. You can become a paid subscriber, or you can make a one-time donation through the Buy Me a Coffee platform. Thanks to those who have decided to support my work financially. Your generosity just blows me away. I'm incredibly grateful. Thank you so much. I feel incredibly lucky. And all of you make that possible. So thank you.